I remember sitting on the carpet in 1984, watching my father stare at the television like it was the only window that mattered. The room smelled like microwave popcorn and cigarette smoke, and the evening news flickered blue across his face. He didn't blink when the anchor talked about debt, deficits, and distant wars that felt strangely close. I was 10, holding a plastic action figure, waiting for him to explain what any of it meant. Instead, he said, "They'll fix it," and turned up the volume as if certainty could be purchased in decibels. Outside, the streetlights hummed, and our neighborhood looked permanent, like nothing could ever really fall apart. Lawns were trimmed. Houses were owned. Paychecks came on Fridays, predictable as sunrise. My father had bought this house at 26 with a single income and a handshake mortgage. He told me stories about his own father working in a factory that never closed, not even during blizzards. That factory is a parking lot now, but in his memory, it still roars like a cathedral. He grew up in a world that had just survived fire and ash and came out shining. Highways stretched across the country like veins pumping new blood into every town. Men had walked on the moon before he turned 25, and that felt normal to him. In his childhood photographs, everyone is smiling at barbecues, holding babies, holding beers, holding the future. Half the country was under 25 once, a tidal wave of youth that believed growth was gravity. He told me they felt unstoppable, like history had reset and they were the first to wake up. Their parents carried war inside their eyes, but they carried rock music in their pockets. They turned the volume up on guitars the way my father turned up the evening news. They said love would fix it, freedom would fix it, tomorrow would fix it. And for a while, it seemed like they were right. But I didn't understand then that their confidence was built on a very specific miracle, a brief moment in history when everything seemed to rise together. The war had ended, the factories were humming, and the world was rebuilding so fast you could smell fresh concrete everywhere. In old footage, men in white shirts pour steel like lava, and the camera lingers on their proud, tired faces. It wasn't just money, it was momentum, like the entire country had decided it would never be hungry again. My father's generation grew up surrounded by inventions that made life softer, faster, easier, quieter. Cars became ordinary, televisions became furniture, telephones became an expectation, and washing machines became a silent revolution. Even the air felt different in their stories, cleaner, brighter, as if the future had already been scrubbed and polished. They lived with the strange belief that progress was automatic, like gravity, like rain, like morning, and they had reasons to believe it. Because in their youth, wages rose, communities held together, and crime was low. The world was safer than it had ever been, and the worst plagues of history felt like myths from dusty books. My father talked about neighbors who left their doors unlocked, and kids who rode bikes until the streetlights blinked on. There were epic national projects back then. The Marshall Plan, highways, the moon landing, the kind of ambition you could touch. But there was another shadow in the background, something no one likes to mention in those nostalgic stories. Because while the world was building upward, the mushroom cloud was hanging silently over every dinner table. They grew up with the idea that tomorrow might not exist, and that changes what you do with your money. It changes what you do with your body, your family, your patience, and your sense of long-term responsibility. If the world might end in nuclear fire, saving for the future feels almost childish, almost naive. So they leaned into pleasure, into speed, into now, and they didn't even realize they were building a habit. A habit of living as if consequences were optional, as if the bill would never arrive. And when you grow up in a golden age, you start believing the gold is permanent. The first time I saw old footage of the 60s, it didn't look like history. It looked like a jailbreak. Crowds of teenagers flooded city streets with guitars slung low and hair longer than their father's patience. They weren't whispering about change, they were shouting it through amplifiers that rattled church windows. In living rooms across America, parents folded their newspapers a little tighter and pretended not to panic. The rules that had governed courtship, family, and faith began to feel negotiable, then optional, then absurd. A small white pill appeared in medicine cabinets and quietly redrew the map between love and consequence. Bedrooms became laboratories of freedom, and the old expectations dissolved like sugar in warm water. My father told me that for the first time, youth culture wasn't just tolerated, it was the culture. Television glowed in every home, feeding faces and voices that told them how to feel about everything. Reading was private and slow, but the screen was immediate, loud, and impossible to ignore. Music swelled behind every televised moment, teaching a generation to respond before they reflected. They were raised by parents who had survived war, but they were shaped by screens that sold sensation. And somewhere in that shift, thinking quietly became less glamorous than reacting loudly. Schools started emphasizing self-expression over self-restraint, confidence over character, feeling over duty. My father once said the worst insult in his high school was being called square. Not immoral, not dishonest, just uncool. High school became a rehearsal for popularity, parties, and performance instead of apprenticeship for adulthood. Teen movies turned drinking and sleeping around into milestones, almost rites of passage. The idea of objective good slowly bent toward the idea of social approval, and the volume kept rising, just like the television in our living room years later. When I was older, I watched my father laugh at old Beatles footage, but there was something defensive in his smile. He told me John Lennon saying they were bigger than Jesus wasn't shocking back then, it was almost obvious. That's how fast the ground moved under them, how quickly the sacred became negotiable. Their parents had lived through ration cards and telegrams announcing death, so stability felt holy to them. But the boomers saw stability as suffocation, like a stiff collar you couldn't breathe inside. They wanted air. They wanted color. They wanted freedom, even if freedom meant tearing down the walls. In every documentary clip, you see them dancing like the world is ending and laughing like it never will. And maybe that's the core of it, because they grew up with both paradise and apocalypse at the same time. They inherited the greatest post-war prosperity in history and also the constant hum of nuclear annihilation. So they built a worldview that sounded beautiful on paper and intoxicating in practice. Don't judge, don't restrict, don't control, just let people be. It was the moral opposite of the Nazis, the opposite of uniforms and camps and brutal certainty. In their minds, the greatest evil wasn't cruelty, it was intolerance. And that fear of intolerance reshaped the entire political and cultural engine of the West. They pushed racial segregation into the grave, and history should remember that as a triumph. They opened doors for women, for gay people, for people who had been shoved into the shadows for centuries. But the same instinct that freed the oppressed also made them terrified of drawing any hard lines at all. They began to treat every boundary like an insult, every standard like oppression, every judgment like violence. In the name of tolerance, they slowly lost the ability to say no, even when no was necessary. And the strangest part is they didn't notice the difference between compassion and surrender. I started noticing it in small places first, not in politics, but in the way adults talked about responsibility like it was an outdated word. At family gatherings, people would roll their eyes at the idea of duty, like it was something you said before you asked for money. They believed in freedom so deeply that they began to confuse freedom with the absence of consequences. The old moral language of honor and restraint felt embarrassing, like wearing a suit to a backyard barbecue. Pleasure became a quiet national religion, disguised as normal life, fast food, shopping malls, and endless entertainment. You could drive down any highway and see it glowing at night, neon signs promising comfort at any hour. In the 80s, we didn't talk about meaning. We talked about winning, about money, about having more than the next guy. I remember the way adults worshipped the stock market ticker like it was a scoreboard for human worth. Even culture shifted. Movies became louder, simpler, and more obsessed with heroes who could fix everything with fists. The past became less important. Philosophy became a punchline, and history became something you watched, not studied. My school made us read endlessly about Vietnam, like that war was the center of the universe. But nobody wanted to talk about Rome, or the Crusades, or the long graveyard of civilizations that collapsed the same way. The boomers, in a strange way, acted like history started when they were born. Their youth became the reference point for everything, the measuring stick, the sacred calendar of cultural memory. It wasn't arrogance exactly, it was a kind of blindness created by growing up in a spotlight. When the world caters to your generation from birth, you start believing the world exists for you. They had been the largest demographic in history, a massive wave that pushed every institution to bend. Television shows, toys, ads, schools, politics, all of it reoriented around their desires. And as they aged, they carried that expectation forward, like a child still waiting to be served. The volume stayed high, and the room never went quiet long enough to think. And here's the part nobody talks about, because it doesn't fit neatly into nostalgia or blame. The boomers didn't just inherit prosperity, they inherited the cheapest capital the modern world had ever seen. My father bought his first house with a rate so low it almost feels fictional now. By the time I tried to do the same, the numbers looked like a dare. He invested early, almost casually, and watched the market rise like a tide that never receded. Money printed in quiet offices flowed into assets he already owned. Stocks climbed, housing climbed, retirement accounts swelled like lungs taking easy breaths, and, because they were already positioned, every surge in value felt like confirmation, not luck. Meanwhile, wages flattened for the young, but capital kept compounding for the established. Factories closed slowly at first, then all at once. And the parking lots grew weeds. The same country that once built everything began importing almost everything. They called it efficiency. They called it globalization. They called it inevitable. But in living rooms like ours, the television still said it would all work out. Regulations thickened around housing, making it harder to build and easier to profit if you already owned. Neighborhood meetings blocked new construction with polite smiles and firm votes. The price of entry rose quietly, year after year, like a tide no one mentioned. Social programs expanded when they needed them most, then strained when the younger generations asked for the same. I remember asking once why the math didn't add up for the future. My father shrugged and said, "They'll figure it out." The same tone he used in 1984. The television glowed again, and the volume went up just a little. By the time I reached adulthood, the promises felt thinner, like paper left too long in the sun. We were told to work hard, get degrees, trust the system, and the system would reward us the same way it rewarded them. But the ladder they climbed had missing rungs when we arrived. Student loans stacked higher than starter homes once cost, and paychecks didn't stretch like they used to. I would drive past neighborhoods my father's friends bought into decades ago and feel like I was touring a museum. Their lawns were paid off, their mortgages tiny, their equity enormous and quiet. Meanwhile, my friends rented small apartments with thin walls and thicker anxieties. The future didn't feel automatic anymore. It felt negotiated, fragile, conditional. And yet, in politics, the same familiar faces kept returning to the screen. Men and women born in the shadow of World War II still arguing as if they were 25. They framed every conflict as good versus evil, heroes versus villains, simple lines drawn in bold ink. Vietnam became a moral wound they never stopped reopening. Korea, fought by their parents, was remembered differently, quieter, almost nobler. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan carried the same confidence I saw in that living room in 1984. We would arrive, we would fix it, we would be welcomed, and then we would go home. When it didn't unfold that way, the explanations felt thin, like slogans stretched past their breaking point. Europe made grand moral declarations while its military shrank and its confidence faded. America shouted about freedom while outsourcing its own industrial backbone. China rose steadily in the background, patient and pragmatic, while we debated yesterday's villains. And through it all, the television kept glowing in quiet rooms across the country. The older I got, the more I realized this wasn't just policy, it was psychology that had hardened into structure. A generation raised on prosperity and television learned to expect solutions that arrived quickly and looked cinematic. Complexity felt like an inconvenience, something to be edited down to a slogan before dinner. Moral grandstanding became easier than moral discipline. Saying the right words cost nothing, but maintaining difficult standards required quiet sacrifice. The economy became the scoreboard for everything, as if GDP could measure dignity or cohesion. Presidential speeches simplified over the decades, language shrinking to match attention spans. We stopped asking whether something was true and started asking whether it felt good. High culture slowly drifted out of the room, replaced by spectacle and repetition. The art became louder, the food became faster, the music became simpler, and the meaning became thinner. And yet, when you sit across from a boomer one-on-one, you don't see a villain. You see someone who genuinely believed they were building a freer, kinder world. My grandmother once told me they were just tired of gray conformity and dead silence. She said Nebraska felt endless and colorless, and they wanted to breathe. They weren't plotting decline, they were reacting to trauma they barely understood. They had been raised by men who carried war in their posture and women who carried ration books in their drawers. Of course, they wanted the opposite of rigidity, the opposite of judgment, the opposite of fear. But every swing away from one extreme risks landing in another. In trying to escape the suffocating collar, they loosened it so much it fell off entirely. And when the collar disappeared, so did some of the quiet strength it once represented. The results showed up everywhere, not as one catastrophe, but as a slow erosion you could feel under your feet. Friendships became fewer, neighborhoods became quieter, and people began living behind closed doors with glowing screens. Divorce rates climbed, trust collapsed, and loneliness became so common we stopped treating it like an emergency. Food became engineered for dopamine, cheap calories replacing the old rituals of family tables. The roads cracked, the bridges aged, the public systems built by their parents started to rust in plain sight. And still, the cultural instinct was to avoid judgment, avoid conflict, avoid saying anything too firm. The world became filled with people who wanted rights without responsibilities, freedom without discipline, pleasure without cost. Even the music followed the pattern, instruments disappearing, complexity replaced by repetition, lyrics becoming noise instead of story. The boomers had once created a golden age of rock, then watched standards dissolve into endless sameness. Their permissiveness created a burst of beauty, then the slow rot that follows when no one guards the gate. The same thing happened with sex. The liberation felt thrilling, then trust collapsed, and intimacy became transactional. Birth rates fell across the developed world, and entire nations quietly drifted toward demographic winter. Welfare programs strained under aging populations, and younger people stared at the numbers like they were reading a death certificate. The environment carried the same pattern because nuclear energy was stalled and carbon taxes were postponed until the problem grew teeth. The debt climbed, the money printing surged, and the future began to feel like a room we weren't allowed to enter. I remember asking my father once why the speech on TV sounded like it was selling tomorrow for today. He didn't deny it. He just smiled sadly, like an adult admitting a secret to a child. He said, "They're giving my generation money, and yours will pay for it." I said, "That's not fair." And he replied, "That's the point." And suddenly, the room felt colder than it had in 1984. Even with the television still glowing. It would be easy to end this story with anger, to point at a single generation and call it failure. But history doesn't move in villains and heroes. It moves in cycles, in pendulums, in overcorrections. Rome had its decadence, the caliphates had theirs. China, India, every great civilization has flirted with comfort too long. Wealth softens discipline, trauma breeds rebellion, and rebellion sometimes forgets what it was rebelling for. The boomers were not uniquely evil, they were uniquely blessed. They inherited the strongest version of Western civilization ever assembled and assumed it would sustain itself. They mistook momentum for permanence and expansion for destiny. And now we, their children, stand on a bridge built from their triumphs and their blind spots. We feel the cracks under our feet, but we also see the view they once saw. We know what prosperity looks like because we glimpsed it in childhood living rooms lit by blue screens. We also know what erosion feels like because we watched institutions fray in real time. That makes us something rare, a bridge generation, able to see both the promise and the cost. We can choose resentment or we can choose reconstruction. We can repeat the habit of turning up the volume, or we can sit in the quiet and think. The real inheritance they left us is not just debt or deregulation or cultural drift. It is a warning about what happens when comfort replaces character. It is a lesson about how quickly a golden age can become a memory. And maybe, just maybe, it is also an invitation to build something steadier. Not by erasing them, but by understanding them. The television is still glowing, but for the first time, we have the choice to turn it down.